So Camilla's daughter was just blocked from royal inner circle access by Catherine herself, and the thing that brought it down was not a public argument, a press leak, or some cinematic confrontation in front of the palace gates. It was a guest accreditation sheet, a revised room access list, and one quiet instruction that removed a single name from a category that really mattered. And that is exactly what makes it impossible to fight. A shouting match can be denied, a leaked story can be spun, but a name that simply isn't on the list anymore, there is nothing to argue with. The invitation just never arrives. The corridor she used to walk becomes the wrong corridor, and the aide who once nodded her through now glances down at a single sheet of paper and, very politely, does not step aside. This is how power really moves at this level. Not loud, not messy. Final. If you follow royal power stories, subscribe right now, because you are going to want to see the exact moment Catherine draws the line, and the look on Camilla's face when she realizes her daughter is on the wrong side of it. At first glance, the incident looked minor. Laura Lopes was not thrown out of the event. She was not publicly denounced. She was not escorted off palace grounds by security. She still had an invitation. She was still expected on the wider guest roll. But there is a world of difference between being invited to a palace event and being cleared for the rooms where the royal working circle actually moves. That distinction is the engine of this whole story. One category allows attendance. Another category signals standing. One says you may appear. The other says you belong close to the center. Catherine did not challenge Laura's presence in public life. She challenged the assumption that private family connection to Camilla should still function as an open pass into spaces reserved for the royal core. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how these events are usually run. Major palace receptions do not depend on warmth, familiarity, or the vague idea that someone has always been welcome before. They operate through layers of clearance. There is a master invitation list. There is a circulation list. There is an arrivals sequence. There are protected interior rooms with separate approvals. There are hospitality zones, reception lines, principal drawing rooms, private holding spaces, staff corridors, and post-event areas where only certain people can stand without creating confusion. A guest can be entirely legitimate and still be restricted from the rooms that matter most. In royal settings, status is not measured only by whether your name appears somewhere. It is measured by which list your name appears on, who signed off on it, and whether anyone still has the authority to question that placement at the final checkpoint. That is why the guest list mattered more than any speech could have. Catherine did not need to accuse anyone of overreach. She did not need to give a lecture about palace boundaries. She only needed to review the categories and decide that one long-standing exception was no longer acceptable. The script becomes sharper the moment the story is framed that way. This was not Catherine storming into a room to settle a family score. This was Catherine using procedure to correct what she appears to have regarded as administrative drift. Camilla's daughter was not a working royal. She was not performing official duties. She was not carrying an institutional brief. She was a close family relation of the queen consort. Under softer conditions, that had been enough. Under Catherine's review this time, it was not. And that appears to be what Catherine had been watching for some time. Not one explosive incident, not one outrageous demand. A pattern, a family presence that had gradually started feeling less like occasional courtesy and more like normalized entitlement. Names on guest lists that seemed to survive on precedent alone. Invitations that expanded from attendance into access. Familiarity that kept converting itself into practical privilege because nobody wanted to be the person who said no. That is how institutions blur, rarely through one spectacular abuse. Usually through small accommodations that become habits, then expectations, then unwritten claims. Catherine's intervention makes the most sense when read as a decision to halt that process before it hardened any further. Laura arrived expecting continuity, and continuity had always favored her. She was known to staff. She understood the rhythms of palace events. She had moved through enough of them to assume that previous access would quietly reproduce itself. Familiarity is powerful in places like that. When people have seen the same face enough times, they stop asking what rule originally justified the access. The face itself becomes the justification. That is why the stop at the entrance hit so hard. It did not merely interrupt one evening. It exposed that the comfort of routine had finally been challenged by a more formal reading of who belonged where. The question was no longer, has Laura been here before? The question was, what is her official basis for entering this room tonight? That question would have surfaced before the event, during the review stage when the access schedule was finalized. These are the moments when palace power becomes visible on paper before it becomes visible in public. Event planning teams assemble the names. Private offices submit preferences. Protocol reviews logistics. Security aligns movement with approved categories. Seating plans, escort routes, and internal circulation all depend on the same underlying logic. Most of the time, the process is smooth because everyone understands the expected outcome. But whenever a name sits in the gray area between family inclusion and official necessity, somebody has to decide whether precedent still controls. That was the pressure point here. Laura's name seems to have reached the stage where someone asked whether prior practice still justified inner clearance. Catherine's answer was no, and once that answer was entered into the process, the rest of the evening was already set. The crucial thing is that such a decision probably did not arrive as a dramatic declaration. It would have arrived as an instruction. Keep the invitation. Remove the inner room category. Preserve courtesy. Enforce protocol. In bureaucratic settings, those are the sentences that matter. They change outcomes without changing tone. They allow everyone below the decision maker to act with confidence because the boundary is no longer implied. It is documented. That is why the most important object in this story is not a headline. It is the list. The list is where the palace tells the truth about who matters in which setting. Public narratives can stay polite. The list cannot afford vagueness when doors are opening and closing in real time. Then came the moment where the paper became reality. Laura walked toward the entrance she was accustomed to using. Staff recognized her, and she recognized them. That made the stop more difficult, not less. It is easier to deny a stranger than a familiar guest. With a stranger, staff can simply follow procedure. With a familiar figure, they know a pause itself communicates that something has changed somewhere above them. So when Laura approached, the hesitation at the door did more than delay her. It signaled that the checkpoint had received a different instruction than the one habit would have supplied. A glance at the list, a second check, a quiet exchange between aides, no hostility, no raised voices. Then the confirmation that her name was not authorized for the inner category. That wording matters. Not authorized for the inner category. It sounds clinical, almost dull. But dull language is exactly what gives such moments their force. A personal rejection can be argued with. An administrative category is harder to fight because it presents itself as already settled. By the time the aide speaks, the decision is no longer a matter for emotional persuasion at the threshold. It is simply the visible endpoint of an approval chain that is already closed above everyone standing there. Laura may well have understood immediately that this was not a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding would have produced confusion and quick correction. This produced verification. Verification means the system already knows what it intends to do. Camilla's proximity changed the meaning of the incident. Had Laura been alone, the moment could have been dismissed later as awkward handling or temporary confusion. But Camilla was nearby enough to notice the delay, register the altered body language of staff, and understand almost at once that her daughter was not being treated under the old assumptions. That is where the deeper power shift revealed itself. The issue was not simply that Laura had been stopped. It was that nobody moved instinctively to restore the old pattern. No one overrode the checkpoint. No one said there had clearly been an oversight. The very absence of rescue told its own story. Staff believed the stop would hold because the authority behind it would hold. So when Camilla approached the doorway, she was not confronting one nervous staff member. She was confronting a completed chain of approval. That is why silence made more sense than escalation. If she protested loudly and lost, the limit on her influence would become even more visible. If she invoked status and the answer still remained no, the old system of deference would be exposed as weaker than she had assumed. Camilla's restraint in that reading was not passivity, it was recognition. She understood that a point had been reached where informal authority could no longer guarantee reversal. In institutions built on appearances, realizing which battles are unwinnable in public is its own form of political intelligence. Inside the reception, Catherine's role was just as important. precisely because it was so restrained. Once the access structure had been set and enforced, she could not soften it without undermining the principle she had chosen to defend. If she stepped in after the stop to make an exception, the line would collapse. Staff would learn that protocol remained negotiable when enough pressure came from the right family direction. If she sent a quick reassurance that diluted the consequence, the old elasticity would return immediately. So the only effective course was disciplined normality. Continue hosting, continue moving through the event, continue behaving as though the list was correct because, from her standpoint, it was. Institutions reassert boundaries not by debating every reaction, but by allowing the enforcement to stand long enough to become precedent. That is where the story becomes more procedural and more interesting. The real significance did not end at the entrance. It moved into the building and then into the workflow that followed. One denied access can still be written off as a singular embarrassment. It becomes consequential when staff begin treating it as a reference point. After any major royal event, teams reconcile movement, note irregularities, confirm that room access matched approval, and identify anything that may affect future planning. In this case, an internal record would have been far more important than any whisper in the corridor. An invited guest sought inner entry without current authorization. Checkpoint enforcement was consistent with the revised schedule. No override was issued. Those kinds of notes are how a one-night decision becomes institutional memory. And once a bureaucracy remembers something on paper, behavior changes. That is the stage your revised direction needed most. Under the older pattern, a request associated with Camilla's family might have moved through the system on familiarity alone. A phone call, a side conversation, a verbal assurance that this had always been fine before. After the blocked access, cautious staff would start asking different questions. Which room category is being requested? What official purpose justifies it? Who is sponsoring the exception? Has the hosting office approved it in writing? If there is no strong answer, the request weakens before it reaches the door. That is how informal privilege contracts. Not because one person wins a loud fight, but because future decisions must survive written scrutiny they once avoided. This is why the incident unsettles palace staff in a deeper way than simple gossip would suggest. Workflow is where power becomes measurable. The moment aides stop relying on custom and start relying on documented role, the advantage shifts toward whoever controls formal review. That appears to be the shift Catherine wanted. A system in which private family closeness can drift into working royal access is difficult to defend, difficult to administer, and dangerous for anyone below the top who may later be blamed for stretching boundaries too far. A system in which access maps clearly onto function is colder, yes, but much easier to justify. Staff do not have to guess which familiar face deserves another quiet accommodation. They only have to read the category and follow it. The next stage in the story, then, is not another doorway. Confrontation. It is the aftershock inside planning meetings. That is where the change starts proving itself. Imagine Camilla's office requesting a modest adjustment for a later event. Under the old climate, someone would likely have found a way to accommodate it discreetly. Under the new climate, an aide says the request must be reviewed. The name can appear on the broader guest list, perhaps, but access classification depends on role. Another official asks whether the guest is attending in any formal capacity. A third wants written confirmation from the hosting office before altering the circulation schedule. That single sequence would say more than pages of emotional commentary. It would show that the earlier exclusion was not an isolated sting. It had already started teaching the palace how to behave. That is also where Charles matters, though not as the center of a melodrama. In a less focused version of this story, Charles functions mainly as a silent witness to tension between women. In a stronger version, he becomes the monarch presiding over overlap between two operating cultures. His reign has often been associated with accommodation, relationship management, and a willingness to let family arrangements remain somewhat soft around the edges if that preserves calm. William and Catherine, as this script frames them, represent something more regulated, fewer assumptions, narrower definitions of who counts as official, less patience for informal seepage between private affection and institutional privilege. Charles does not need to erupt for that contrast to matter. It matters because the household around him can feel the transition before succession ever formally arrives. That is why this moment reaches beyond Laura and beyond Camilla. It becomes a preview of what the next court may look like. If Catherine is already willing to review family-linked access through the lens of role rather than relationship, then the future operating standard becomes easier to imagine. Fewer relatives moving casually through spaces reserved for working principles. More category distinctions. More written approvals. More insistence that the monarchy's inner machinery cannot function as an extension of whoever is closest to the sovereign or closest to the sovereign's spouse. That makes the blocked access less like a private rebuke and more like an early governance signal. Notice how much stronger that is than repeating the idea of humiliation. Humiliation is real, but it is not enough on its own. If the script keeps circling only around wounded feelings, the story flattens. The competitor's strength is that it keeps opening new administrative layers, a document, a review channel, a testimony issue, an enforcement mechanism. Then the consequences. Your revised version needed the same ladder: accreditation, category review, checkpoint enforcement, internal memory, changed staff behavior, successor era implications. Each step moves the story forward instead of sending it back through the same emotional beat with different wording. That is also why any Diana reference should remain brief. Audience memory may color how some viewers interpret Catherine drawing a boundary against Camilla's family reach. But if that memory becomes the script's main engine, the tone turns symbolic rather than investigative. One line is enough to acknowledge that history intensifies perception. Then the narrative should return to process. The process is stronger than the symbolism because process is what makes the event believable. It explains why no one fixed it, why no one overrode it, and why people inside the palace would read the moment as a serious development rather than an awkward social misunderstanding. Laura's position is especially revealing because she sits exactly in the zone where affection and authorization collide. She is not controversial in this story because of anything outrageous she personally did. She is controversial because her presence forces the palace to answer a question it would rather leave blurry. When does kindness become clearance? Catherine's move suggests that kindness can remain, but clearance must be justified. That distinction sounds technical, yet it is devastating in practical terms. The moment you separate courtesy from entitlement, a whole network of assumed privileges becomes vulnerable to review. People who once moved on momentum alone suddenly need a reason that can survive documentation. Staff would take Catherine's line seriously for more than one reason. Certainly her personal authority matters. So does the fact that she is future-facing inside the institution. But the deeper reason is administrative self-protection. A role-based access system protects everyone lower down. It protects the aide at the door from accusations of personal insult. It protects event planners from being forced into ad hoc accommodations that may later be questioned. It protects private secretaries from having to convert social expectations into operational decisions without cover. Most of all, it protects the monarchy from the appearance that inner space can be granted indefinitely to non-working relatives simply because nobody wants an uncomfortable conversation. Catherine's boundary works because it is not only firmer, it is easier for the system to defend. That is what makes the place card such an important image. A place card seems trivial until you understand what it represents. It is not merely a piece of stationery. It is a physical marker of inclusion at a particular level of access. Remove the card and you remove not just a chair but a claim. The same is true of the list. The list is not an accessory to the story. It is the mechanism of the story. In institutions like Buckingham Palace, power often appears first in small administrative objects: a card on a table, a highlighted line on a schedule, a badge category, a note in a briefing folder. Those things decide who moves freely and who discovers, often too late, that the rules have changed above them. By the end of the evening, anyone who understood palace logistics would have seen the significance clearly. A guest had not simply been inconvenienced. A habit had been interrupted. A category that had long been stretched by familiarity had been tightened by review. Staff had been shown which decision would stand under pressure. The future center of gravity inside the royal structure had made itself visible without a speech, without a confrontation, and without the need for public explanation. That is usually how real institutional changes happen. Not with theatrical declarations, but with a moment when everyone suddenly realizes that the old shortcuts no longer work. And the lasting consequence is not that Camilla instantly became powerless. That would be an overstatement, and overstatement weakens the script. The lasting consequence is narrower and more persuasive. A limit was exposed. Camilla's family connection could still open some doors, but not every door, not automatically, and not against a reviewed access structure backed by Catherine's authority. Once that limit is exposed, everyone around it has to adjust. Camilla's office becomes more careful, staff become more literal, future requests become slower and more documented. The old confidence that certain names would always be waved through begins to erode. Limits are more believable than collapse, and they create better suspense because they suggest more tests are coming. So this story matters not because Laura was embarrassed for one evening, but because a mechanism of soft access was challenged by a mechanism of formal control. Catherine did not need an argument. She needed a process, a list, and the institutional discipline to let the list hold when pressure arrived at the door. That is the lesson Buckingham Palace would have taken from the scene. Not that tempers flared, not that rivals traded blows, but that precedent had finally been forced to answer to review. And once a palace begins shifting from precedent to review, the question is never only about the last person who was stopped. It is about the next person, the next request, the next event, the next family expectation presented as harmless because it has been harmless before. That is why the blocked access resonates beyond one reception. It suggests that the future royal court may prefer documented boundaries over inherited assumptions and role-based entitlement over social drift. Laura happened to be the person who met the new line at the door. But the real audience for Catherine's decision was everyone inside the palace who had grown used to treating proximity as status. They received the message, and once a message is enforced by paperwork instead of emotion, it tends to last much longer than anyone outside the building realizes from now.